right. Thank you, Noah. All right, we are continuing in our series through the book of Ephesians in this series that is called Worthy, where we are exploring the truth that we serve a God who is worthy of our praise. And he has called us a people worthy of his love and called us to walk in a manner worthy of our calling. And we have been exploring and thinking about this worthy calling that we are called to walk in. And what does that worthy walk look like? What does it look like to live a life, to walk the walk in a way that is worthy, that represents well the nature of our God and the truth about who he is and what he has done? And we've been exploring over the last few weeks in particular how we learn to walk in those ways and how we get practice in those ways and grow in those ways through the relationships that God has given us, the people that God has placed in our lives, especially within the church and especially within our own families. He has placed us together in order to shape us together. And he has given us to each other as gifts to be shaped as iron sharpens iron by one another, to be more and more what he has called us to be. And that is especially true, as I said, within our own families, within our households. If we are in a Christian household, it is designed in such a way that all of the people within the household are supporting one another and caring for one another, and God is at work in shaping us through that process. And we've talked over the last couple of weeks about the husband and wife relationship and how that relationship is intended to be supported from both sides, and how both of those people in a marriage hold each other up and support one another. And we talked last week about the relationship between a parent and a child and how they also are putting one another, each other's needs before their own, and supporting one another as they walk down the road following Christ. And today we are going to talk about another set of common relationships that we have. Relationships that actually, for many of us, if not most of us, it takes place in the place where we actually spend the majority of our waking hours, and that is in the workplace. And so as we begin to think about that this morning, I just want to call to mind for you when you are getting ready to go to work. What is the feeling that you get when it is time to start another work day? Maybe it's the time when you are driving to the place of your employment, or you've gotten out of bed and you've gotten ready and you're getting ready to log on to the computer from your home office. Is it a feeling of looking forward to the engagement that you will have in that place of business? That you're looking forward to facing the challenges that will be in the road ahead and solving those challenges? Are you pumped for that kind of situation? Or on the other end of the spectrum, is it a feeling of dread as you drive down the road, as you begin to walk towards the computer? Is it a feeling of frustration as you imagine those challenges that are sure to come? Is it a feeling of anger at the demands that have been placed on you? And I realize that those are two ends of a spectrum, and many of us probably fall somewhere in between. But if you lean more towards the second one than the first one, then you are not alone. In fact, the statistics show that you are in very good company. Gallup, in its State of the Global Workplace report, found that along with dissatisfaction, workers are experiencing staggering rates of both disengagement and unhappiness. They say that 60% of people reported being emotionally detached at work. 19% of those said that they were miserable. And there were only 23% of people reported feeling engaged. That's globally. In the U.S. specifically, 50% of workers reported feeling stressed at their jobs on a daily basis. 41% said that they were constantly worried. 22% said that they were sad. And 18% said that they were flat out angry. And it's not just about the hours that you put in. It's not about work-life balance always. It's not just about the workplace location. It's not just those things that leave people dissatisfied in their work. In fact, worker disengagement rises with remote work. But stress levels rise with in-person work. And so the nature of our schedule, the nature of the location has an impact, but it's not the whole story. Workers are unhappy at home, unhappy at the office. They're unhappy if they're working a 30-hour week. They're unhappy if they're working a 60-hour week. And it's been found that the majority of the world's employees are, tell me if you've heard this term before, quiet quitting. It's a new term that I've recently become exposed to, quiet quitting. Quiet quitting is what happens when someone is there in person, but they are psychologically disengaged from the work. They may be physically present, they may be logged into their computer, but they don't know really what to do with that time. They don't really have a sense of why it even matters, and they don't really have any supportive bonds with the company or their coworkers or their boss. And the truth is that nearly 6 out of 10 employees fell into this category, just disengaged. And it occurs to me that this seems to arise, at least in part, from a loss of a sense of purpose, of not knowing what am I here for. And so as we're considering the way of Jesus as presented to us in Ephesians, I'm wondering, what does this way, this worthy walk, have to say to this kind of phenomenon? How do Christians walk in a manner worthy of our calling in that environment? We can actually learn some helpful principles that will lead us in this respect. Actually, from what Paul has to say to the last of the 3 household relationships that he talks about, household relationships of his time. And in fact, this last relationship is, by the grace of God, one that doesn't exist for us anymore in our culture. That is the relationship between slaves or bondservants and masters. Let's take a look at what Paul has to say to this group within the household of his time. He says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." As a necessary side note as we begin to talk about this, as Paul is addressing this relationship, I think that we should recognize that this is not an endorsement of the institution of slavery. Absolutely not. But it is a recognition that at the time that Paul writes, this is a reality of the way that the society was structured. In fact, it's estimated that about a third of all the people that lived in the Roman Empire were slaves. And so it was a significant part of the population, and trying to imagine society functioning in this place and time without that institution would be sort of like us trying to imagine our own society without electricity. It's something we can try to think of, but it just doesn't seem to work, and you're not sure how that would be achieved. It is challenging to try to wrestle with. And the truth is that when Paul is writing to a church in Ephesus, it is bound to have members of that church that are going to be either slave or bondservant owners or slaves themselves. And those people in those relationships needed instructions for how to operate within that relationship because it was just one that existed for them. They needed instructions. And in fact, the ethic that Paul gives us here and in other places actually works to undo the fabric of the way that slavery worked. And in fact, if Paul's teachings are carried out as they eventually were, it unravels the fabric of what slavery is even built on and makes it untenable. And so that's the little side note that I feel like is necessary when we are reading a scripture like this. It has something still, even though this is not a relationship within our own households, it has something to teach us about our approach to work, our approach to labor. And there is a key mindset that reshapes everything when we are thinking about that part of our lives. The key mindset is this: as followers of Jesus, we work in the presence of God and under His authority. When we work, whether that is in like an official workplace environment, or if it's a different type of work, someplace that we are investing labor in another way, or perhaps even in school as students, this all applies there as well. Wherever we do our work, we are in the presence of God and under His authority. This is a key concept. Look again at the first thing that Paul says. He says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ." With fear and trembling. Fear and trembling of who? At first glance, when you first read this, you may be inclined to think that he's talking about they should be afraid of their masters. And the masters of the time would say, that's right, they should be. But that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul is using a phrase that he uses in other places. He is not talking about fearing their human masters. That's not what Paul means. Let's look at a couple of other places where he says the same exact phrase. In writing to the church in Corinth, he says to them, "I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling." Now, he's not saying he was afraid of the church in Corinth. He says in 2 Corinthians, talking about Titus, he says, "Titus's affection for you is even greater as he remembers the obedience of you all, how you received him with fear and trembling." Paul is not saying that the church in Corinth was afraid of Titus. This is a phrase that Paul borrows from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And he borrows this phrase to use it to talk about being in the presence of God. This is the way that he uses the phrase being in fear and trembling. You can see it here in when he writes to Philippians, the church in Philippi. He says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling in the presence of God." This is the way that Paul uses the phrase. He's not telling them to be afraid of their master. He's reminding them of the God that inspires fear and trembling by his presence. Every time God shows up in the Old Testament in some form, the people that he is coming to respond with fear and trembling. Think of Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah being caught up into the throne room of God, and he is terrified. He falls down and says, I'm a dead man. You think of Moses at the burning bush, becomes terrified and falls down before the bush. You think of all these moments in Scripture, the presence of God is captured by this phrase. And so we can think about being in the presence of God when we are working. Sometimes we can think about coming to this place, coming to the church building and gathering with one another, and think about there being in God's presence. And certainly we are. But I would like for you to consider that just as much as you would say you are in the presence of God in church, you are just as much, it is just as true that you are in God's presence when you badge in to the office, when you roll up to the job site, when you log on to your Zoom call, when you get ready to stock the shelves or chop the ingredients for the day, when you sit down in your classroom or put your books away in the locker, God is present. And in that place, you serve him. As Paul said in the very same context in in Colossae, the scripture that Noah read for us, he says to them, whatever you do, and this is again instructions to those slaves in Colossae. He says, whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. In the work that you do, you are serving the Lord Christ. And so just consider, whatever it is you are doing, as Paul says here, work heartily. That is, pour your heart into what you are doing. Put your heart into it, not because the company deserves it, not because you fully understand and you see how it works and you understand that what you're doing really makes a difference, not even for merely the paycheck, but because you are serving Jesus. Put your heart into it for that reason alone. When we carry that mindset, when we understand that as followers of Jesus, we work in the presence of God and under his authority, when we carry that mindset into all of the work that we do, it can transform that work. And it can transform that environment. Because then what we are doing is not merely doing our job, we are worshiping. We are worshiping our God. And so that's the rest of this sentence. As followers of Jesus, we work in the presence of God and under his authority, and all of our labor can be redeemed as worship. Can be redeemed as worship. That is to say, it is exchanged. It is exchanged. It is not just about that company. It's not just about that job or just about that task or just about that assignment. It is about worshiping our God. That project that seems pointless. Those processes that are overcomplicated. The physical and mental strain that seems to get old really quick. All of it is traded in for a whole new purpose. To be offered to God in worship. Consider this. If you are worshiping with your work, consider that when you, a follower of Jesus, enter the workplace or enter into your school, you carry with you the divine presence into that space. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 3:16, "Do you not know that you are God's temple, that God's Spirit dwells in you?" The temple where that was a place of worship, because that's the place where God dwelt. You are that. You carry his presence. You carry the place of worship. You carry that with you where you go. And when you enter into the workplace or into school or wherever you are bringing that divine presence. On top of that, you carry the presence because you are a temple. And on top of that, you are also a priest in that temple. Peter says, and he's quoting from the Old Testament, he says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood." You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What if that was the mission you saw when you went to the office? What if that was the way you thought about the work that you do day in and day out? You are a priest, demonstrating God's presence in the way that you serve him there. So work can be, it should be, worship, which gives a powerful new purpose to the daily grind. I want to spend the rest of our time thinking about what that would look like based on what Paul says to the slaves and masters in Ephesians 6. What would it look like if my work was worship. What would it look like if you went to school and the work that you did there was worship? What would it look like if you were logged into the computer, to the office servers or whatever, and that was worship? What would that look like? First point is this. Work that honors God, work that is worship, is done with integrity. Work that honors God is done with integrity. Wherever you are, whatever your work is, it doesn't even matter. Whatever your work is, even my work, there is the ever-present temptation to cut corners whenever possible. To figure out, tell me if this sounds right, to figure out in your job, what is the minimum that you can do and get away with that and still keep your job? And then just do that. There is the temptation to fall into that. That's that category of the quiet quitting that we mentioned, that most people seem to be finding themselves doing. Figure out the minimum and just do that. Or to justify a little harmless dishonesty. It's only partly untrue when it benefits you. I saw a company that, very large company that was doing background checks on about 3.8 million people a year. And they found that about half of those had lied on their resumes. That's a lot of lies. But we can justify stuff like that. It seems harmless. Who will even know? It doesn't seem to make a big difference. It's kind of true. Or maybe there's that situation of kind of dragging your feet on the job site during the work hours. You get paid hourly anyway. So what's the motivation to really get it done? And so drag our feet during the day and make it stretch out. Now, when the supervisor comes by, everybody's suddenly working really hard, but as soon as they disappear, it's back to break time. And wouldn't you know it, the job doesn't get done, and so we need to put in a little bit of overtime. But when the overtime comes, magically you're able to get it done in a record-setting amount of time. But you gotta still hang around for a little while so it doesn't look suspicious. You ever experienced something like that? Or maybe you work from home and the temptation is to download some software that moves your mouse around a little bit every now and then so it keeps your computer active and it looks like you're still logged in and working even though you're out playing golf. Maybe there's a temptation to do something like that. Or maybe there's a temptation to find somebody else's work on the internet and plug it into your own report and say, this is something that I did, or plug it into Chat GPT and say, this was all my work, or whatever the case may be. There are all kinds of unethical things that we can do or be tempted to do. But work that honors God is done with integrity. Like Paul said to the servants here, he says, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling in the presence of God, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Look at this, not by the way of eye service or as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Eye service, people pleasers. He's pointing out the way that people behave when someone else is watching, and doing it just for that reason. Just imagine if you were tempted by some of the things that I mentioned or similar things, and you gave into those things, just imagine offering that as worship. Imagine bringing that kind of work and laying it on the altar before God. Would you feel good about that? Would he be pleased with that kind of offering that you bring to him? Work that honors God is done with integrity. It is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know, probably. Even when doing the right thing won't benefit you in any way, even when doing the right thing actually works against your interests. The other day I was talking to my son, and we were talking about how he was asking the question, what What if you hear something from my teacher and she says I did something and I didn't really do it, or she misunderstood what was going on? How will you believe me? And it was an opportunity to tell him, if there's a history of knowing that you lie about these things all the time, then I'm going to be more likely to believe the teacher. But if there's a history of knowing that you tell me the truth, that you have integrity, and I know that you tell me the truth even when it's hard, then I'm going to think most likely the teacher misunderstood something perhaps, and we can talk about that. And you see how integrity is investing in a good outcome in that sense. Walking in integrity matters, especially when we're offering that work as worship to our God. Proverbs 10:9 says, "Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his ways crooked will be found out." Eventually, the truth comes out. Proverbs 11:3, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the crookedness of the treacherous destroys them." Walk in integrity. Even if we can get away with it in the moment, God is aware of our lapse in integrity. And he is ultimately the one that we answer to, right? He is the one that we serve. Galatians 6, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." Let's not grow weary of doing good. Don't grow weary of doing good, walking in integrity, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So don't give up. Keep doing what is right. Keep doing what is right even when it is hard, even when it is tiresome, even when it feels thankless. Work with integrity to honor the God who sees all. And that's the second point, is that if we are offering our work as worship, then we can find fulfillment in knowing that even when our efforts are underappreciated, God sees. Even when our efforts are underappreciated, God sees. Do you feel like sometimes, even when you are doing what is right, even when you're offering up in your place of employment or wherever you put your work, you're offering up your best. You're really actually putting in the work and working hard, and probably harder than other people around you, and yet you still get passed over for promotions. In fact, maybe there's a situation where your boss doesn't even thank you, doesn't acknowledge what you've done, or maybe even takes credit for what you did. Maybe it seems like you're doing the work, but everyone else is just carrying on the same as if you had done nothing, and everybody else is cutting corners and getting away with it, and it's frustrating. And you don't know what to do about it. Just know that if you are offering your work as worship instead of merely serving a company, you know, you have the fulfillment of knowing that your God has received that worship. Your God sees. To go back to the passage again, he's telling them we are to render service with a good will as to the Lord, not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is bondservant or free. So rest assured that when you pour your hearts into whatever you do to honor God, none of it goes to waste. None of it is wasted. Not a moment of it escapes God's notice. He sees. I think of the story about Hagar, who proclaimed in her distress that God ministered to her, and she proclaimed that he is the God who sees me. It's Genesis 16:13. Know that when you are offering your work and pouring your heart into it, you're offering that to God. God is pleased with what you offer him. You will be blessed as a result in so many ways. And it may not be that the stacks of cash just pile up around you, but you will be blessed in so many ways that go far beyond what finances could ever do. 1 Corinthians 15:58, Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." In the Lord, your labor is not in vain. You may not, as I said, be piling up the cash, but you are developing a richness in the depth of your connection to the Creator of the universe. And He's the one you'll spend eternity with. That's the relationship we want to invest in. He says, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 6:10, "God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for His name in serving the saints as you still do. And we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." Don't become sluggish. Don't become lazy, as he says here. Work with integrity. The world is unfair. The world is filled with people that are ensnared by evil, and those people will work without integrity. And some of them will appear to get ahead as a result. But know that the true God, the master of all, sees, and He is just. He loves you. He is glorified by the honorable sacrifices that you make. And your true reward is more than a bi-weekly paycheck, but forever in His loving presence. We want others we work with to see that. We want others that we work with. So we are the temple of God. We are priests of that temple, and we bring that into wherever we are, and we bring that into our workplace. So our work is worship. We want others to see that, to recognize that. And so the third part of this is any authority or leverage that we have should be used to glorify God rather than ourselves and demonstrate His love to others. Whatever power, whatever authority, whatever leverage, whatever position God has given you, use it for His glory. Use it to benefit His worship, to benefit others, to serve in the way that our God serves. There's a temptation to use any moment of power that we find in our hands, to use it for our own benefit. But when our work is worship, we can see it as a chance to honor Him in a meaningful way. Paul reminds in this dynamic of slaves and masters, he reminds the masters, the ones that have the power in the relationship, he reminds them of this. He says, "Masters, all those things that I told the servants about, honoring Christ and what they do," he's like, you do the same. Stop your threatening. Don't threaten them. Knowing that He who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with Him. Remember that even the one in power is not the highest power. Whoever is in power is not the highest power. There is a God over all that is master of the masters. He is the one who rules all. And I'm reminded of Jesus standing before Pilate. And Pilate kind of sort of bragged about the authority that he had over Jesus. He's like, "Don't you know that I have the power to set you free or to crucify you?" And Jesus responds to him and says, you would have no authority over me if it wasn't given to you by my Father. He points to the one that has greater authority than him. And I'm also reminded of Peter in Acts chapter 4. When Peter is hauled in before the Jewish religious leaders, and they say, "Stop talking about this Jesus guy. You're making us look bad." Like, don't preach in this name anymore. And Peter says, we've got to obey God rather than men. He points to a higher authority than them. So just remember that whatever boss you have, there is a greater master, there is a greater Lord, there is a greater authority than that. And when you find yourself in a position of some authority or some power, whether it's official or not, over someone else, remember that that authority is over you too. Because you don't have to be the boss for this to apply to you. You don't have to be the boss for this to apply to you. We all, at some point, find ourselves in a position where a decision we make affects other people. Where we have, in that moment, a power based on the decision that's been given to us. We have a power to affect others' lives. And when those moments arise, remember this, that you are to use that moment of power to serve Christ, to honor Him, to glorify God, to offer it to Him in worship and show His nature to others. So remember, when your actions affect others, what Jesus is like. Philippians 2:5, he says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Remember that we represent him. And authority, leadership in a Christian way, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, is service. Being in leadership as a Christian is about lifting others up, using that power in that moment to lift others up, about being self-sacrificial and taking our ego and laying that on the altar of worship before God. Remember what I read to you. I read this passage a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the household leader, the father, the husband as the household leader, and how that's a calling to be self-sacrificial and serve your family. And we pointed to Jesus talking about authority and leadership. And he says in Matthew 20:25, he says, Jesus called his disciples to him and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus is the King of the universe, and he came not to be served, but to serve. So when you find yourself with any authority or any leverage or a decision that affects other people, use that moment to glorify God. And that is offering your work up as worship. And so I'm inviting you through all of this to redefine the way you think about your work. And I think that practically I would suggest that you start to reshape the way that you think in the way that you pray. I want to encourage you and recommend to you to pray during your commute to work. Pray just before you log into the computer if you're working from home. And not just to pray that you will have a good and hassle-free day. Maybe that's something to ask for too. But that as you go through whatever the day brings your way, that you will keep your eyes on Jesus. That you, whatever that workday brings your way, will remember that you are in his presence. And that you will have the strength to pour your heart into whatever it is that you do for his glory above all else. I would invite you to have that prayer as you make your way to your place of employment or to your school. Also pray that while you are in that place, that your God will open doors for those around you to witness the divine presence that you carry. That they will see the light shining through you and recognize Jesus. Also, I would encourage you to pray for your coworkers. Pray for your boss. Pray for those who are under you. If you are in a place that has customers, pray for the customers that will come through those doors. Pray for the people that you will be around, knowing this, that God is at work in our work, in both what we do and in how we do it. And he's using that to shape us into better disciples and to draw others to himself. God is at work in our work. We may not always see what God is up to. We may never see some of the things that God is up to in our work. But if we are faithful in it, that has a shaping a shaping effect on our character. And it has a shaping effect on the people and the environment around us. We don't always know what he's up to, but I guarantee you, God is up to something in whatever we devote to his service. And just remember this, your work, whatever you do in a given day, may be the answer to someone else's prayer. Somebody else may have been praying about something so random and obscure you never would have thought of it, but they needed it. And you provided it, either directly or indirectly, and God used you to answer their prayer, and you will never, ever, ever know it. But how many times has God answered your prayers through somebody, and you know they had no idea? When you are in that place, someone may see your integrity, they may be inspired by it, and they may never, ever say a word to you about it. But the seed was planted. They were inspired, and God is at work in that moment. You never know what God is going to do. 1 Peter 2:11, we'll begin to wrap up. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." He's recognizing that people may say untrue things about Christians. People may be antagonistic towards them, and they may not appreciate them in the moment. But if you walk in integrity, if you continue to do good in their presence, then one day perhaps they will be people that offer up glory to God, glory to Christ, on the day he returns. And this is a great thought to consider. How many people will be with us in the next life with God because of events that God set in motion through the way that we carried ourselves at work and at school? John 12:32, Jesus said, "When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me." When I am lifted up, I will draw people to myself. And he was talking about the cross. But I think that, as with many things in John, there are multiple layers to what is meant. And I think that is also, as we lift him up, people are drawn to him. People are drawn to Christ, not by what we do, but because we lift him up, he has a drawing effect. And so, 2 Corinthians 5:20, remember this. We are ambassadors for Christ. We are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Believe it or not, your work is important. Believe it or not. Whether you're making slides for a meeting, or pouring concrete, or stocking shelves, or rolling burritos, or answering phones, or delivering pizza, or selling real estate, or writing reports, or taking a test, every single bit of it, those and a million other things, can be a moment that points others, both boldly and subtly, to Jesus. So may we lift him up in our workplaces and in our schools. May we do what is right even when no one is looking, knowing that the one who matters most never misses a thing. May we replace any self-focus we have in those places with a focus on God and a sense of our mission in Him. And may we redeem all of our work as worship. In just a moment, we're going to sing a song, and I'll be at the back of the room with the elders. And if you have any needs, if you want somebody to pray with, if you're ready to be baptized and follow Jesus, if you just want somebody to talk to, that's what we'll be back there for. And we would love for you to reach out to us while we sing the next song. But let's wrap up with this final verse. Psalm 90, verse 16. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands.